Okay, so in the interest of time, this is more of like a curiosity. I'm gonna skip the middleware stuff, but if you want to check it out, I'm gonna use it because it will allow us to do cores stuff. But ultimately, for your projects, you won't need to worry about core stuff because all requests will be coming to and going from the same IP address and port. But for now, since we're doing local development, you're going to have your local Django API running on port 8000, localhost 8000, and then your web server, if you're using like VS Code's live server, you'll be making requests to port 5000. So because those are different origins, they're different ports, so we have this issue. It's pretty easy to make your own middleware that does that. This is basically it. You just add some headers. If you're interested, if you're specifically interested in this, you can ask about it. But I'm just gonna kind of skip this. That was a bonus thing.
Just a quick question about that. What file would you add that to?
Yeah. So you can
Classified?
create your own file. So I'm gonna pull this up. So I'll clone this down. We can take a look at it. So this is the with cores middleware branch.
Not to slow things down, but just out of curiosity.
Yeah. Yes. So that should be here. So you can actually put it in more than, it kind of doesn't matter where you put it. But since it's middleware that is applicable to everything in the project, I just put it in the project at the project level. But the way it works is this is actually just the path to that. So if you have it in wines, it's wines dot whatever file, in this case called middleware, and then cores middleware. So if you put it in a different project, it would be, you just have to give it the correct path, basically.
Cool.
So so all this middleware stuff, I'll just say quickly, it's basically just, you can think of it as, filters maybe. So everything in Django is basically based on a request or a response object. So you start with an HTTP request, it goes here, and then everything that happens is basically manipulating and reacting to a request and then sending some kind of response. And middleware is just like, you can kind of like filter that request and response through all of this stuff. So it's kind of just like, get that initial request and then call this, blah, 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 blah. So by the time it gets to your actual application code, like your view, it's gone through all of that stuff. And the same is true with the response. So it goes through all this middleware filters, it manipulates the initial request, then you do your logic here, and then a response gets generated. So you send some kind of response, and then that response also goes through all that middleware. So the response goes through all this stuff again. So if there's anything you want to do, like especially if it involves adding something or checking every request or most requests, you can put it there. But you really aren't going to have to do that. It's more of just FYI for curiosity. Okay. So we'll spend a little bit of time. Would anyone care to walk me through? Let me pick on Joyce.
Yes.
I knew you're hoping I would pick on you.
No. Okay.
Since you're an expert on authentication now, can you tell me about what's happening here in this chart? First off, what kind of graph is this?
What kind of graph? Like a flow chart?
Yeah. There's a name for it. Does anyone know? Now I'm blanking on it. What's it called? Okay. Well, I'll think of that later. If we inconvenient time to forget. But this is a standard kind of graph or visual representation that you'll see, especially when you're dealing with like APIs and services that talk to other services and stuff like that. It's basically a sequence diagram.
Okay. So it described basically between a user and an API. When user try to sign in, they send their request to API, and then API will then respond with a token. And so in the future, when you put in the same username and password, it will have that token attached to that request, and then so the API will know that this is the same user and will basically will send the response.
Okay. Yeah. So when you sign up initially, you're basically you're going to give the API certain information, and this is basically arbitrary, but username, password is a typical combination. So that comes in here. So if we have our view, so we have this sign up view which we've created, and then what we're doing is we're getting that request and we're checking the username and the password from that request. And we're basically going to exchange that for a different credential. So if you think of the username and password as like it's like the most important. It's the real ultimate credential, and because it's so important, you don't want to be passing it around all the time. You have to do it once. You have to do it that initial time, but you don't want to be passing around that kind of master credential all the time. So what you'd like to do is exchange that for something else that isn't as important but can also serve the same purpose. And that's basically what a token is for. And there are different kinds of tokens. The token that we're using is basically just like a random hash. And there are more sophisticated ones like JSON web tokens. So let me just for the sake of showing, you guys won't need to know this. So W14D4, I think, is a really good site. Yeah, so if you're interested in JSON web tokens, often called JOTs, so JOT or JWT, JSON web token, it's got that there are a couple different variations, but the full variation has 3 parts, and this is what you'll see. This is the JSON web token. Notice that this looks like just random garbage, right? But it's not. It's actually encoded, so not encrypted, but encoded in base 64, I think. So if you decode this, which you can do, like you can just, if you know it's base 64, you just decode it and you can get that this is JSON. It's called JSON web token because it's JSON. And it has a header. It has a header, and there's a few different keys that you can have. JSON web tokens are fairly flexible. And then a payload. So this is what you would kind of care about. So this is basically metadata about the JSON Web Token itself, like what kind of algorithm it's used to create, blah, blah, blah. And then here's what you actually care about. Here's the information that's important. Like if I'm the application, I want to know, the user's name or whatever. And there's also this IAT issued at. Does anyone know what this huge number is or could be?
Is it like date and time or something?
It is a time. It's a way of measuring time.
Like the total amount of seconds from, was it like 1970 or something, whatever that is?
Yep. Yeah. So this is Unix time. So Unix time, I forget what, I don't know if it's January 1st, 1970 or something, but it's seconds since then. So that's commonly it's a common time format that's used, and it's the standard for JSON Web Tokens. So oftentimes you'll have issued at. You can also have like expired at or TTL, so time to live. Most tokens will come with like the time that was issued and then the time that it expires. So this token doesn't have that, but you'll often have that. And then here is basically a way to validate that the token came from where you think it came from. So if you have a server that's issuing the token, that actually gets like stamped with a certificate. And then the service which is reading the token can check that using a public key. So you don't need to know about any of that, but it's basically a way of making sure that, hey, this person says they're allowed to access this resource. Can I trust that? Is this just like, did some random person just send me a token? If it's signed right here, if it's signed with a private key and I have a public key, then I can verify that signature matches. So I can be sure that this token came from a server that I trust. So I can therefore trust the information in this token. Now this token, despite, as I said, despite the way it looks, it's actually not encrypted. It's just encoded. So anyone can read this. And this is true for any kind of any credential authentication system. You have to be using HTTPS. You have to be using encrypted HTTP traffic in order for any of this to be meaningful at all. So if you're not using, and we're not right now, but if you're not encrypting everything, then it's basically insecure anyway. So even if you have this super cool, complex authentication system, if it's not, at some point you're gonna have to send a credential. At some point you have to send a username and a password, or a token or whatever. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick introduction to JSON Web Tokens or tokens in general. The token that we get is not nearly as sophisticated as this. This has structure and meaning, and you can manipulate it. The token that we get will just be basically a random hash. So even simpler. Okay. So a user, I'm going to send, I'm going to sign up. I'm basically going to send some credentials. And then my API is going to take those credentials and say, okay, yep, I'll go ahead and create an account for you. But all I've done is like created a new user. That user still doesn't have any way to actually authenticate. So you can sign up for something, and then if you want to access a resource later, well, you have to tell the server who you are again. So you could just keep sending the username and password, which is actually, it's actually called basic authentication. It's the, kind of the original or the simplest form of authentication, where you're just sending the username and password every time, which you can do. But here, we send a username and password, we create a new user, and then you can also create a token associated with that user. So if you think of creating a user, you're basically creating a row in a database, right? So a row in a database with columns like email, password, whatever. And you can also have token. And then anytime you send that token, the authentication system can make a request to that database and check, hey, does this token match the token that I have saved for this user? If yes, then it's a valid user. If no, then it's not a valid user.
So basically, when the user signs up for the website, they're assigned a specific token, and that's the token that will be attached to that username and sign up for the entirety of its
Yep.
existence.
Yeah, so the whole point of the giving that initial username and password is so that you can then get a token. You can use that basically to generate a token, and that token will be the thing that determines who the user is.
It just enables the user to access the token, essentially.
Yeah, so basically, if you have a protected resource, like an API endpoint, which is secured and doesn't just allow anyone on it, so if I'm a user and I want to make a request to that endpoint, I have to tell the endpoint, hey, I'm allowed to access this.
Would that be like maybe like editing their profile or something?
Yeah, exactly. So that would be a typical, usually anything. So you can have all kinds of different complex things, but at a basic level, often like reading a resource will be, anyone's allowed to read a resource, but if you want to modify a resource, you have to be logged in, or you have to be logged in with this set of permissions, or so on. So how do you send a token? So what is the format that you use? So let's say I sign in, or I sign up, I give my username and password, a new user gets created. So there's a row in the user's database or whatever for me. They send me back a token. How do I use that token?
You're gonna set it in the local storage.
You okay? Let's just say I don't even have I'm not even doing this from a web server. Let's say I'm doing it from curl or Postman or something like that. So I have the token, and now I want to make a request to a protected endpoint.
Oh, you would just add it to the header under authorization.
Yeah, exactly.
You would send a get with authorization.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously, there's all kinds of variations, but a very common pattern is that there's an authorization header, and if you want to make a request there, in your request you add a header, right? Because you can add headers in your request, and if you're the server making responses, you can also add headers to responses. But your header says, authorization. So that's a standard HTTP header, authorization, and then the value will be that token. Often it'll be like the word token and then space and then the actual token, or bearer and then space and then the token. There's a few different variations you might see, but it's at some point you're including that token. So that token, you send that with the GET request, and when the server receives your request, it's going to check that header. It's going to check, hey, is there anything in the authorization header? If so, let me read that in. I'm going to extract the token from that header, and then I'm going to actually make a request to the database, and I'm going to check that this is a valid token.
So an API key is basically a token.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So you sign up for some, third-party API or whatever, and then you give them your information, your username, password, maybe your credit card or something like that. They store that, and then they say, hey, I'm going to give you a token, and this token is going to represent you. So anyone who has this token, we're going to assume that it's you, which is why you don't, put your token on GitHub or whatever. Because if someone has your token, effectively, they're you. They are you according to the API. Because the API doesn't do any other check. It's just, are you sending me a request that's formatted properly? I check the header. I look at the token. Okay, that's a valid user. So I'm going to assume that that request came from that valid user. Okay. So the process is kind of a multi-step thing where if you're doing it Postman, for example, you will make a request and you'll include the username and password, and then in the body of the JSON, you'll get some kind of response, which typically is going to include the token. And then once you have that token, or this could happen in one step or two steps. So in this case, it's actually happening in two steps with the implementation that we're going to use. So you send your username and password. The behind the scenes in the database, a token, a new user is created with a token. Then if you want to get that token, you make a specific request to like a get token endpoint. You do that, you send your credentials. Those are checked against the database. Okay, this is who I think it is. I'm going to give them their token. So you get the token. Then in any other interaction with the service or endpoint or API, you're going to include that. So we want to basically take that from Postman being this set of steps that you have to go through every time to putting it basically in a UI that's a little easier to use. And the UI that we're going to build will be terrible, but when you guys actually do your projects, it'll be easier, especially with React. It's easier to work with stuff like this. All right, so I'm gonna take a look at this. Actually, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna start. So Docker close up -d. All right, so that's gonna get started. I'll have the database, then I'll have to run migrations, and then I will run the server as well. All right, so while that is happening, I'm gonna do this just for the sake of simplicity. I'm gonna do this in the same project, but your front end could and should be like a separate project. I'm just gonna do this here. And I'm gonna create index.html and styles.css and app.js. Okay, my API is running, so I'm gonna do Docker PS. Okay, here's my container. So only the database is Dockerized. So locally, I'm gonna run everything in Django locally. So first, I'm gonna create a virtual environment, Python -m -venv. Okay, I'm gonna activate it. Source, then bin activate, and then I'm gonna install the requirements. Pip install -r requirements.txt. All right, so now I will run the migration. So I've got basically a blank database, and I've got my local project. So I want to apply all of the migrations. I think I need to make, I'll run make migrations first and then actually apply that. So Python and then .py, make migrations. Okay, that's fine. Python. There's .py, migrate. This will apply. This will create all of the schemas in my database. Most of these are default Django stuff. Couple, this is actually, something that, I made or we made or whatever. And then this, there's a whole bunch of auth stuff. Now this is auth token. So there's some more token stuff that's happening. We don't have to worry about it. Django's taking care of it. Part of the package. Okay. So now I have run migrations. I'm actually going to run this setup data just so I can have some dummy data in there. So Python manage.py shell. I'm just going to execute this, kind of cheating a little bit, and then exit. Okay, I'm also going to create a super user so we can take a look at the admin. It'll be easier to see like the token stuff. So Python manage.py create super user. Okay, now I will run the server. Python manage.py server. Okay, and I can go here and I'm going to go to /admin and we'll log in. You can see that I have users. So this is what I directly care about. And I have one user created, which is the super user. And so here is, this is a nice representation, but ultimately this is a database table with, username, password, first name, etc. So here's the username, here's the password. Notice it tells you here, raw passwords are not stored. So there's, you give it a password and then it will run some kind of algorithm on it with a salt and some other stuff. So there's, some complex stuff that I don't, really understand. I don't really understand how it works. But, a bunch of fancy encryption stuff happens. So your password is not stored as just raw text in the database. Okay. Notice here, there's another tokens table, and that tokens table exists because, let's see, because we're using this right here, this add-on. So notice that we don't have any tokens. I have a user, but I don't have a token for this user yet. Okay. We'll see that change a little bit. Any questions so far?
Yeah, are we going to be using bcrypt for our hashes for our projects?
You will almost, unless you want to,
Okay.
you'll just use something that takes care of it. So you won't have to make that decision. If you wanted to get down those details, then you want to implement your own thing, that's fine. But yeah, you definitely won't have to. And like I basically wouldn't recommend that you do it, but if you want to do it for fun, go for it.
Well, I know like the amount of hashes, if it's too many, it takes really long for like when a user creates an account, it'll like load longer. It'll be like,
Yeah.
2-3 more seconds. So
yeah,
they're high level stuff that probably don't really need to go over.
yeah. So I mean, I'm not a security expert, but I think it is, computer security is like real world security where nothing is really secure. You're just deterring low effort. You basically you're creating a threshold of effort that's required to hack you.
Until quantum computing comes out.
Yeah, I guess. And then we're all screwed, or no one's screwed. I don't know. Okay, all right. So we'll go ahead and go through this web interface here. So this is the HTML, and you'll see how terrible this is in a second. I did just use ChatGPT to generate CSS. And then this right here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just run this using the live server extension. I'll pull this up, and this is not really connected to anything. This is just the front end. So the idea is, we'll use the Wines API to get information to actually populate this. So get info. If you click this, if you're basically it'll make a request to the endpoint to get a wine. If you're an authorized user, it'll give you something back. If you're not, it'll give you an error. And then this is the login or sign up form. So username and password, etc. We're basically just gonna implement the behind the scenes logic to do all this stuff. All right, so we start with sign up. I'm going to replace this. So this will allow us to sign up. So when this window loads, first we're going to grab the form, which is right here, the username and password. And then we're going to add an event handler, which is going to call handle auth whenever that form is submitted. And handle auth is going to do call prevent default. So what does prevent default do?
Prevents it from refreshing.
Yeah. So the default behavior when you submit something is that it will basically make another request to the page, but we don't want that to happen. We're going to handle it ourselves. All right. So we're going to get the credentials from the form. So we're going to get the username and password from the form. And then we're also going to check and to see, this is just the implementation detail to see, because we're using the same form for sign up and log in. And then to sign up, we're going to take that username and password, and just like you did in Postman, we're basically going to create a JSON object with these fields, because that's what the API is expecting. And you would know this because you would have tested it with Postman first. And then we're going to make a post request, and we're going to let the API know that, hey, this contains JSON. Excuse me. This contains JSON. We're going to stringify the body, which is this right here. And then we're just going to make a fetch request here to whatever /accounts/signup. And if we look at the application code here, if we start at the top level URLs, we're going to go to /accounts. So that's over here. We look at accounts URLs. There's two kind of sub endpoints, get token and sign up. And for sign up, we're going to call this sign up view. And sign up view is this right here. It is a subclass of the create API view from the Django REST framework, which is going to do a lot of stuff for us. We just have to kind of follow this format. Ultimately, what's going to happen though is it's going to take that request, it's going to parse the body, and it's going to look for the username and the password, which we got from this form, this HTML form, through the JSON right here. So that's where the username and password is coming from, and then we package it up in a request right here, in a basically a JSON object. So the view is gonna parse that request and look for those fields, and then it's going to create a user. And this is a special method that basically handles like password hashing and stuff like that. So you don't just ordinarily, if you have like your own, model like books or whatever, you do books.objects.create, right? If you try doing that user.objects.create, it would work, but it would be wrong. So the password would not be saved and encrypted, and you wouldn't be able to use it. So it wouldn't throw an error here, but it just wouldn't work. So when you're talking about users, you have to use this special create user method.
I would like to mention that perform create is not arbitrary. It's actually a hook. If you read the documentation in REST framework, for the life of me, I cannot figure out how it was getting called.
Wait, sorry. What? Oh, the perform create. Yeah. So
Yeah.
You have to override this. That's what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like a GET request. The perform create. It's just a hook. So if anyone was confused on that, it's in the documentation in REST framework.
Yes. Unfortunately, there's a fair amount of that kind of stuff. I don't know why I can't get in here. Yeah. I don't know why that's not working. But if you dig into the Django source code, it's kind of a mess. There's lots of subclasses, and so it's difficult to figure out what's getting called. But yeah, so sometimes you have to dig around and figure out which method you need to override. Okay, all right. So we should at this point be able to actually create a user because of this stuff right here. So let's see if that works. So I've got the network tab open. Okay, so I'm going to try and create a user. And this will be sign up, submit. Okay, so I can see the requests. I have 2 requests, which is maybe a little strange. So I get a response from this one. This first request, though, the request method is options. So this is basically something that will happen under the hood when you're dealing with authentication. So you don't need to worry about that, but that is happening. What we care about is this right here. So we're trying to sign up. We are, let's see, request headers. Let's see if we can find the body right here. So this is the request payload. This is, if you had used Postman, you would have sent this as kind of JSON. We got this from a form and then converted it to an object and then converted that into JSON. And then the response is this, and that's just whatever the server decides to do. Okay, so we should have just created a new user. We can go into the admin and check that actually happened, and there is a new user, ASDF. You can see that the password is hashed. And if we look at tokens, we don't have a token for this user. So we've created a new user, but we can't really do anything with this user, at least in this application yet. All right, so let's see if we can log in. So log in this context means get a token. All right, so I'm gonna replace this. We're gonna add, basically gonna add this right here. So sign up is still the same. You just grab the username and password from the form, you package it up the way the API wants, and you make the request. That will create the user. You want to sign in, which means get a token. We're going to use the username and password from the form. And then we're going to make that same request, but we're going to make it to the get token endpoint rather than the sign up endpoint. And we should be able to grab the token. So this API is going to send a response. You know, different APIs, there's going to be slight variations, but probably you're going to get something with a key called token and a value. So let's see if that works now. So this time I'm going to use the same user password, but I'm not going to sign up. This is going to be, you know, logging in. Clear this. And I submit that. And now I have the token. So I can take a look at that. And this is what I got. Token, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what do I actually do with that token? Well, what you do is there are a few different ways to handle this. This is not really secure, but we're gonna do it anyway. But we're gonna have to somehow store that credential, because you don't want to have to every time you make a request, you basically have to log in again, because that kind of defeats the whole point. So you give the user a credential and you want them to like track it basically. So hang on to it, and then anytime you make a request, you can just include that. So you don't have to go through this process of logging in every time. So we called local storage. So what is this local storage?
It's a browser API.
Yeah, so what does that mean? What is a browser API?
I think it's like a universal API with a browser that allows you to do different things. I know, like with local storage, you can store information in there, and the only way you can access it is with set item and get item, I think.
Yeah, so this is unfortunately it's not quite universal. So each browser can implement their own stuff, but this is basically add-on. So it's not, strictly speaking, it's not JavaScript. It's not core JavaScript. It's just stuff that a browser can do that you might want to have access to. So it's an API because you're not directly doing it. You're basically saying, hey, I want to use some method that you have, browser, and this is how you do it. So it's possible that in Chrome that this works, and then in, you know, Internet Explorer or whatever, this particular method doesn't work. Okay, so this is local storage set item. So apparently, what's happened is that we have this handle off method that gets called when I click submit. And here I've already signed up, so I'm going to take this path. So I'm going to get the token, which is right here. So I send my credentials and I get a token in return. And then that token is going to get put into local storage. So where is it now? Can I access it?
Can you view it in the DOM somewhere?
Okay, good. Yeah, so you can actually view it using the developer tools. And the way you do that is you go to application. So it's not an obvious category, but you go to application and then local storage. You can see it right there. So again, you go to application and then local storage, and then you should be able to see the token, so the key value. So what we did was we signed up initially. That takes care of it on the database's end, basically. So our, in our database, they have a user. Now, as a user, I want to actually start doing stuff. I want to log in so I can do stuff. Well, because this is, an API and we're using a token, logging in isn't such a direct process, but we're going to get a token. We're going to use our credentials to get a token that's going to allow us to access protected resources. And that token is going to stick around right here. So we can just pull it and use it anytime we want to make a request.
So is there a new token created on every login, or is it the same token once the user logs in one time?
Yeah, so this is a very primitive token. So in this case, it's just one thing in, like in a more sophisticated version, like a JSON web token or something, it would expire, periodically. So you every time you make a request, you get a new one, basically. And then there's also refresh tokens. So yeah, we don't have to get into all that, but this is basically it's basically the same thing as username, password. But yeah, so it's more so for purposes of the course, like, you don't have to be an expert in security or cryptography or anything. But going through that process of like, I have a credential, I get something else, and then I use that in the request. That pattern is everywhere.
So do you normally see like session storage rather than local? Or does it really just depend on the application?
Yeah, I would say the most common thing you would see would be to put it in a cookie or something like that.
Okay. And when you said that wasn't the secure way earlier, can you elaborate briefly on that?
Yeah, because one, local storage is not encrypted, and basically anything else could access local storage. So if you had some malicious JavaScript running somewhere else, it would be able to access the contents of local storage. So it could basically steal your credential.
So would that be like the HTTP versus HTTPS you were talking about earlier?
That's one thing. So yeah, if you set it in the cookies, so again, like none of this stuff is perfect. It can all be, hacked or whatever, not by me, but by other people. But yeah, so if you put it in a cookie, you can have more control over what accesses it. And then you also still have to make sure that when you're sending it and receiving it, that it's encrypted. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how cool your auth system is. At some point, like you have to send a credential.
Okay, cool.
All right. Okay. So we can sign up. Now we can log in, i.e. get a token. So now we're going to actually use the token to access something. Copy all this. All right. So we have this like the form part, which is going to handle like signing up initially and logging in. Now we have this other part. If you look at the the UI here, so this is the login or sign up. Here's the actual application that we care about. Here's how we access the hidden stuff. So blah blah blah. What we're gonna do is fetch the results. So we're gonna assume that someone is logged in, and we're gonna go into local storage and we're going to grab that token. And then we are going to insert it into the authorization header. And, every server could be slightly different, but this is a very common pattern. So authorization, the word token or the word bearer or the word something similar, and then the actual token itself. And that's pretty much it. So you sign up, that creates a user in the database. You request a token, you get that token, and then anytime you make a request, you include that token, and our application is going to check that an authorized user is making this request. So let's see if that works. So I do have a token right now, so I should be able to get the wine. So I do. So this is, terrible UI, but I'm making a request and I'm authorized to do that. Now I'm going to refresh this. I'm going to delete this token right here. Now if I try to get info, I'm not allowed. And I can look at the network. And I get 401.
So a logout button would basically delete your token from your local storage.
Yeah.
In this case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, in a more sophisticated system, you'd have like a session token or even a JWT, and you can actually when you have a few different options. Most JSON web tokens are built to expire, relatively recently. So logging out is kind of, depending on what you're doing, maybe a moot point anyway. But one thing you could do is basically send a request to the server, and then the server can not blacklist, but basically add that token to a list of tokens that are not valid anymore. The issue with JSON web tokens are basically to a certain extent, it's JSON web tokens are not meant to require direct access to the authentication server. So we don't have to get into the details, but it's meant to be just all I have to do if I'm the consuming application, if I'm the API, all I have to do is check, hey, was this token signed by this key that I have? If the answer is yes, then I give access to the resource. Like, I don't care about, I shouldn't have to make another request to the application server and check the validity. So if you have a token and it's not expired and it came from this authorized source that I trust, then I'm going to let you have access to the resource. You can add another step there where you say, okay, also check the blacklist first, and then blah, 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 but that makes it more complicated.
I imagine you can kind of like set how long the token is good for.
Yes. Yeah.
Based on like maybe screen activity or something. I'm trying to think of like a bank account login where it logs you out after like 2 minutes of inactivity or something.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so not only do you have that token, but usually when you're dealing with JSON web tokens, you get a pair of tokens. You get the actual token, and then you get a refresh token. And the actual token, for something like a bank, yeah, maybe it expires, after 5 minutes or 2 minutes or whatever, like pretty quick. But then you have a refresh token. So if your actual token expires, you use the refresh token to get another token that you can then use.
So like that's like if your mouse moves or something where they can sense that you're still like active, basically.
You could do it that way. Sometimes it'll be basically like you try to make a request, it fails, So check if there's a refresh token. If there is, then make a request at that point. So it could be based on like, if there's a failure, then try and refresh, or it could just be something like, I just gave you a token and a refresh token. The actual token expires every 5 minutes. So every, minute or whatever, I'm just gonna check. I'm gonna check and I'm gonna make, so it just depends on how you decide to implement it. And then you can set an expiration time for your refresh token. And if your refresh token expires, then you have to like log in again or something like that.
What was the time format called? Unix?
Yeah, Unix. Let me see. Yeah, so the Unix epoch.
Cool.
Yeah, January 1st, 1970. Okay, cool. So I am logged in. So I'm logged out. So I'm gonna log in. I'm gonna check my right here. So I don't have any tokens stored. So I've already signed up. So I'm just gonna log in. I submit that. There we go. Took a second. Undefined. Interesting.
I wonder if for the sake of this app, you have to sign up every time you want to log in.
You didn't have to. There you go. I am not sure why that didn't work. But yeah, so I'm sure there are lots of bugs. This is meant to just be kind of a demonstration. Okay, so now I have the token. So now I should be able to access this again. So that is the basic idea. And then yeah, there's a final logout, which is basically just remove the token from local storage. My computer is struggling right now. So we add this logout, and it's basically just, it's going to go into local storage, and it's going to remove something called token. So that's the basic idea. When you actually do this for real, you'll have a better front end. You'll be using React, and it's easier to keep track of stuff like a token. So yeah, so when you get to React, you'll have something called state, which is basically something you can, like a value that you can keep track of while you're on the page. So it's kind of a short-lived. If you refresh, that would go away, but that would be one way to store the token. It'd be very short-lived. You could use this, and you could use like local storage, or you could also use a cookie. But the cookie thing is a little bit more complicated, so I don't want to focus. I want to focus on the basic pattern rather than that particular detail. Okay, and then for the challenge, it's basically just going to be building off of what you guys did yesterday. So just make a front end for some kind of API, and just keep it as simple as possible, basically. And that's it. Any questions?
not necessarily with the lesson, I guess, but so maybe a little bit with the lesson. So since we've started working on like our personal projects, I know doing like models won't be an issue, but I know we said like how we're gonna do stuff is gonna change a little bit. Is there any